Thank you very much, Arian, for the very nice introduction. And thank you, Sepideh, for providing me with this opportunity. I'm very happy to be here. So as Arian mentioned, we're going to be discussing psychoanalytic topology today, the link to modern science, Lacan's uses of mathematical formalization. And what we, in a sense, want to look at is what kind of philosophical consequences modern science bears, and at least according to psychoanalysis, and how psychoanalysis has sort of entered that space of the modern as well. So after this, in the last days, somebody was telling me that, now this may seem a bit funny that I'm bringing this up, but it was an interesting thing for me. Chris Rock, after that famous incident in the Oscars, he's got a world tour going on, and the name of the world tour, from what I heard, I haven't been following it, but it just so much was talking about this all over the place. It's called Ego Death. I thought it's a very interesting title for his talk and for his stand-up routine. Ego Death is pretty much what this talk could have been called as well, in a sense. Why? Because this is what topology, Lacanian topology, is about. It's about giving a new shape. The ego from the very beginning was always depicted in spatial terms. Freud had his little diagrams, ego, id, superego. Then Lacan came along with his mirror stage, which in French is actually le stade du miroir. And stade is more a spatial idea. It means stadium. The stadium of the ego was depicted as this shape. And then the topologies came to give a new way of imagining this ego, but imagining it in a way that brings about the demise of the ego, in a sense, hence ego death. So in a sense, Lacanian topology is a way of contesting narcissism. And we will see why. So the talk will have two parts, in a sense. The first part is the longer, more substantial part. And then at the end, there'll be another part as well, a little bit shorter. The first part will be dealing specifically with Lacanian topology, with Lacan's relation to mathematical topology. And then, or what he called structural topology. And then the next part, in that part, I will also talk a lot about Lacan's relationship to Kant specifically, and I will color that with reflections on Hegel's relationship to Kant as well. The other part will concern the birth of modern mathematical science and the relation of Lacan to mathematical science, specifically in the way the historical break constituted by mathematical physics, mathematical science, was theorized and understood by Alexandre Poiret, a famous philosopher of science. So these are the two important parts. They're very much related because Lacan's topology is very much a kind of response, if you will, or is very much inspired by the ideas that Poiret puts forward in relation to this massive epistemological break between the ideas of the ancient science, the Greek episteme, as it was called, and the birth of modern science, which, according to Poiret, and Lacan entirely agrees, constitutes a radical break with little continuity. So Lacan and topology. Lacan worked with mathematicians throughout his career. He worked, for example, with Georges Guibault. They remained friends until Lacan's death. His exchanges with Guibault led him to an interest in cybernetics. That was already right from seminar 1, so very early on in the teaching. It led him to interest in topological surfaces, which we will look at to some extent today. And that kind of, I would say, started from seminar 9 onwards. Then the Borromean knots, these are like the Olympic rings, these 3 rings, real, imaginary, and symbolic, and the way they are intertwined. All of these come from his engagement with mathematicians, particularly Georges Guibault. And the Borromean knot came even later in his teaching from, let's say, seminar 19 onwards. He worked with topologists such as Pierre Souris and Michel Thomé as well. So he was interested in mathematics and topology throughout his teaching. So let's give a little bit of an introduction to some of these ideas of topology. So Euler was a very famous mathematician who was very important in topology, and he discovered a kind of constant, a kind of rule that he thought was generally true for polyhedrons. And his formula was that if you take a given polyhedron, if you take the summits plus the faces and you subtract the edges, you will always have, so summits plus faces minus edges will always equal to 2. We can try with a cube, like a dice, right? So if you take a cube, it has 8 summits. It has 6 faces, that's 14. And how many edges does it have? If you count the edges, there are 12 of them. So 14 minus 12 is 2. And you could do this for a pyramid or whatever you want. Now, interestingly, mathematicians such as L'Huillier and Moebius were interested in topological figures that constituted exceptions. And Lacan was interested in the exceptions. The torus, the Moebius strip, the cross cap, the Klein bottle, these all don't fit under Euler's rule. They're all surfaces, for one thing. And this is what L'Huillier said. He said certain polyhedrons that only have one surface are exceptions to Euler's law. And these are precisely the objects that are of interest for psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is generally interested in what breaks the rules, in marginal phenomena. It likes the exceptions. It sees in the exception a greater opportunity for truth than in the cases that follow the rule. This was something Freud stated explicitly. For Freud, quote unquote, mental illness was not some kind of anomaly within the experience or the phenomenon of the human. It was rather an opportunity to see in a very overt way what was generally true, but in an implicit way for all humanity. So these types of services, which offer an exception to Euler's law, became of huge interest for Lacan. Now, other than surfaces, now these were all surfaces, knots are other kinds of objects that Lacan was very interested in. And the difference between knots and surfaces was very, very different, was very important for Lacan. Surfaces, the ones I had mentioned, Klein bottle, Moebius strip, Torus, and so on. Lacan used these in his understanding of the psychoanalytic act, the interpretation, an act that happens through speech. These acts have a direct effect on the patient's psychic reality. That's the aim. Now, the point here is this. There's a very, very important clinical point incarnated by the fact that Lacan chooses these surfaces to incarnate, to give body to the psychoanalytic act. And the reason for that is that the interpretive act for Lacan is not aiming at some depth, but rather is trying to reveal a kind of torsion, a kind of twist or kink on the surface of speech. This is a great departure that Lacan takes with respect to post-Freudian psychoanalysis. In post-Freudian psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis understood itself as a depth psychology, meaning the idea was to go deep in the unconscious. What Lacan is progressively showing, and he had this right from the beginning, is that the unconscious is not some depth that is inside. In fact, the unconscious is not necessarily something. It's rather a twist or a torsion within the surface. It's something that disrupts the smooth flow of the surface. It's not some hidden, deeper meaning that we have to excavate. This was very important for Lacan right from the beginning, and it was something that he exemplified in his reading of Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter. You know, the story is about this letter that gets passed around from one person to the other. Everybody's trying to get their hands on it. And at some point, somebody's trying to hide the letter, and the best way of hiding it is just by leaving it right on their desk. And people come and go, etc., and nobody actually bothers taking it because it's so out there open. You know, this is in line with another idea that Lacan has, which is the best way to lie is to say the truth. So the unconscious has this particular topology. It's that it's right there on the surface. It's not hidden in some beneath, but it's on the surface in a twisted way that keeps it hidden, but not hidden in a depth. So these topological surfaces are a surface that don't have depth, but they are very complex surfaces. They're paradoxical and difficult for the human mind to imagine without some difficulty. And this is exactly how the interpretive act also is. It's right there on the surface, but the interpretation functions not because it finds a depth, but because it creates polyvalence and equivocation. That's, you know, the psychoanalytic correlate of that twist. Something that Freud spoke about in terms of overdetermination. What it means is that any given symptom or psychic phenomenon is always going to have a number of meanings, so many that in a sense, we could say it just doesn't really have a meaning at all. And the interpretive act doesn't dig deep, but creates a torsion on the surface or reveals the torsion on the surface, which is the polyvalence and equivocation. So a good interpretation is not one that touches something that is solidly there or waiting to be unveiled, but a good interpretation is measured by how much new material it brings about in the psychoanalysans, the analysans of free association. Knots, on the other hand, don't have anything to do with the psychoanalytic act at all. They are not concerned with the interpretive act. They concern rather the whole series of acts that take place to constitute the whole treatment, the whole direction of the cure. They account for the whole transferential relation between the analyst and the analysand in the whole duration and its whole evolution. They provide us with a theory of the structure of the subject. And a very famous example, of course, is in Seminar 23, Le Symptôme, where Lacan provides a kind of Borromean knot of Joyce's structure, which involved the three knots, real, imaginary, symbolic, but unlike the sort of typical neurotic situation where the three knots are entangled in such a way that if you cut one, they all fall apart. In his case, the knot of the imaginary was very easily prone to slip off. It wasn't properly knotted. And so, according to Lacan, James Joyce had to create a fourth knot for himself to tie the imaginary to the others. And Lacan called that fourth knot the corrective ego. And, you know, Joyce's ego was, of course, ego meaning self-image, was tied to his conviction that for hundreds of years, his works will be read by scholars and that he is indeed the greatest artist of his time. That corrective ego kept the three registers safely knotted together in a singular way. So that's what the knottings are about. They're to give a kind of overall structure of the subject. So surfaces deal with brief clinical sequences while knots deal with the complete case. But the important point here to remember is that topology is not a simple formalization. the important thing is that the singularity of every case has to be taken into account. The knots, this sort of topological figuring happens after. We have to first have the case, and then the Borromean structure can be made. So it's not a kind of generalization that, oh, every human is this way or that way. It's a kind of formalization, if you will, but it's a formalization without generalization. It comes after the fact. And this is, of course, very important for psychoanalysis, where the most fundamental rule of it for the clinician is to take every case as absolutely singular. Now, what comes with Lacan's topology is a very important realism. In this sense, Lacan is like a Platonist. He believes that, I quote, there's a strict equivalence between topology and structure. Topology is not a metaphor for Lacan. This is a very radical claim. He really doesn't think it's a metaphor. It's not a way of depicting the structure. He really thinks it is he believes that it is the structure itself. Something here has to be taken very literally for Lacan. And it's literal because what is at stake, amongst other things, is the subject's very relation to space. And hence this spatialization, this topological spatialization, is not a metaphor, it's, the thing itself. Now, the space is very, very important to understand structures. In schizophrenia, for instance, space can feel very, very, very closed. So closed that the subject-other distinction is sometimes entirely dissolved. Perhaps in cases of autism, space is entirely desubjectified and lacks emotional coloring. In phobia, like in the famous case of little Hans, the little boy who was afraid of horses, the fear of horses structured the little Hans's relation to the world. Now, our relation to space is very subjectively colored. Humans don't live in a space that is, measured. The closest thing to me might be my glasses, but in a sense, the closest thing to me are the images on the screen or the text I'm reading or whatever. There's a subjective coloring. Now, topology tries to understand that structure. Topology is not made to guide us. I'm quoting Lacan. It is this structure. So topology is not made to guide us in structure. It is this structure, unquote. This is a very, very important point. The way in which spatiality gets constituted for the subject. This is not, for Lacan, a metaphor here. Now, all of this is very important, has huge consequences, according to Lacan, for philosophy. And Lacan is presenting this topology in a way as an objection to Immanuel Kant. He refers several times when discussing these matters, he refers to Kant's transcendental aesthetics, or the transcendental apperception. The transcendental apperception is for Kant something that makes experience possible. It's the point at which the self and the world come together. Now, in psychoanalysis, we have a correlate to this, and it's called the mirror stage. The mirror stage is the moment the subject looks at the mirror, sees a unified image of him or herself, and takes that as the source of his or her identity. And at the same time as a unified image of self is created, the world kind of gels together as well. And it gels together in a very specific way for everybody. And for Kant, it gels together differently given the different historical time in which one lives. The transcendental today is going to be different from another time. For Kant, it determines what can be seen and what cannot be seen, what can be understood and cannot. Same way with the mirror stage. It kind of creates this frame for identity and for the image we have of the world. Now, interestingly, this is the novelty that Lacan introduces, which is very important for Lacan, becomes increasingly more and more important as his teaching progresses. It was hardly mentioned at all at the beginning. The beginning was the mirror stage, one of Lacan's very early papers. The first version of it was written probably in 1936, but that one was lost. And then he rewrote it, or rewrote a different version of it in the late 40s, in 1949. This was a very important paper. And as time went, what Lacan started to emphasize beyond the mirror stage, which is this psychoanalytic equivalent of the transcendental aesthetics, what he started to emphasize instead was this objet petit a, this little object that slips out of that moment of identifying with the mirror image. It's an object that does not get captured in the image, and it disrupts the image. It is, I like to say, the foreign object that resists being included in the specular image. So I quote Lacan. He says, there is thus the A, he means the object A, which is the remainder, this residue, this object whose status escapes the status of the object derived from the specular image. That is the laws of transcendental aesthetics. So Lacan casts his project, his topological project of creating a kind of new imaginary that is capable of giving body to this objet petit a, this object A. And for him, this is going to be part of an endeavor that will overcome the limitations of Kant. Lacan says, I quote, I maintain that transcendental aesthetics has to be recast in our times. So Kant's object is specular. It is capable of being entirely included in the mirror image. It can be represented. It has positive qualities. You can name it. It has an identity. The object A, on the other hand, is an object without positive sensual qualities. It doesn't have a specular image. It is a disturbance and distortion in appearance. It is not graspable. It is ethereal. It's mercurial. It is mostly a non-identity. It's not stable. It's at once a lack and a surplus. Has this weird, double status. It subtracts something from the image, making it incomplete, but it also adds something extra that troubles the image with a kind of uncanny excess. So the object of psychoanalysis, the objet A, the object A, is not the empirical object. So the post-Freudians developed the idea of a partial object, most notably Carl Abraham, and this was, of course, elaborated further in the work of Melanie Klein. The partial object theorized by the post-Freudians is not yet quite the object A, insofar as they still saw it as an empirical object. The breast, the feces, etc. The object A is more the loss of an object than an object itself. It's like the loss of the breast, the loss of the feces, and so on. And this is a very important aspect of it. It's lost, and this loss nonetheless creates some kind of excess in the form of desire. This is what escapes from the transcendental aesthetics, and Lacan is building this topology to create a new transcendental aesthetics. So as we said earlier, the the mirror stage constitutes the identity of the person and at the same time creates the world. And so the human being creates an image of his or her body and then starts to believe that he or she is this body. And the body is perceived as being very whole because it's seen as not having this objet A. And this object A is this paradoxical object that kind of takes something out. I quote Lacan, "Man loves his image like what is closest to him, that is his body. Only his body, he has no idea of it. He thinks it's me. Everybody thinks it's them. It's a whole. And on the outside, there is the image. And with this image, he makes a world." This is very, very important. We create an image of our body, and with this image of our body, a falsified image that gets rid of the lack. With this image of our body, we then create a world, also a false world. I quote Éric Laurent, he says, "It suffices to have an image that is the foundation of a representation, and with this image, we create a world." This is very important. So to put it systematically, the body is marked by some trauma. The body is a whole, meaning that there is something that escapes the mirror image of the body. In a sense, we could say Kant's transcendental aesthetics doesn't take trauma into account, the constitutive trauma of being human. The body is marked by trauma. The body is a whole. We fill this hole with the belief and with external objects. The image is the first such object, the first barrier to this whole. With this image, we make an illusory world. Topology is required to undo this imaginary illusion. This is the whole point of topology. But however, it's very important, you first need to have the illusion, to have a modicum of sanity and mental health. The psychotic often is missing that. That's what the corrective ego is attempting to do for Joyce, to keep the minimum of that illusion alive. So the image hides something. What it hides, as we said, is trauma. In a sense, what it means is it hides anxiety. It hides the enjoyment and anxiety specifically that stir the body up. That anxiety and enjoyment has a technical name in psychoanalysis, a French name, which is jouissance. It's this sort of energy that keeps the body sort of in movement, suffering, anxiety, enjoyment. All of that gets hidden from the image. The image is purified from jouissance. And this is what we see in the evolution of Lacan's work. We move from an emphasis on the image to a greater and greater emphasis on that which the image hides. What does the image hide? The image hides jouissance. It hides the drives. And this is what narcissism is about. Narcissism is preoccupation with the image in order to hide what the image lacks, the excess that the image is persecuted by, jouissance, etc. That's narcissism, in a sense, is the effort to hide and veil that over. Some of it is essential, like hygiene. Hygiene is a necessary narcissistic practice. Somebody has no hygiene, it means that they're not loved. You know, usually by our age, everybody has some hygiene, but teenagers, you know, sometimes there's the one or two who don't have hygiene, and they are often subject of great mockery in high schools, that the one or two kids who don't have hygiene. And what is it a sign of, really? It's a sign that you're not loved. That's the main point. In order to have hygiene, you need to be loved. You need to have self-love. You need to be able to make the effort to purify the image of your body from all its excessiveness. And, this is why there's often problems of hygiene in psychosis, because narcissism is faulty in psychosis sometimes. This is the peculiarity of being human. In order to take care of our bodies in some of its most basic functions, like toilet functions even, we need to be trained, we need to be loved, we need to be seduced into it by our parents. Our contemporary situation has this type of narcissism as part of it. Biopolitics, as Foucault called it, is the phenomenon by which we are encouraged to take care of our body, to be healthy, so that we could become better workhorses for capitalism. It's a form of narcissism. Surveillance, we are watched and we know that we are being watched. The gaze of the other is always there. Social media, most importantly of all these, social media. Well, what is social media? Instagram. Instagram is Kantian transcendental aesthetics. It's posting images of yourself without the objet. To put it in Zizek's term, is like decaffeinated coffee or non-alcoholic beer. Instagram is images without the objet. You don't see the suffering, the pain, the lack, the boredom of everyday life, the common unhappiness. All of that is subtracted. One gets a very curated image in general. So there is a heightening of narcissism. We could say that our late modernity is a grand modern mirror stage, or Kantian transcendental aesthetics. Of course, even clinically, this is the case now, where a lot of psychoanalysts continue to work with their patients on Zoom or whatever, which I think is definitely a mistake. Sometimes one is forced when the pandemic, but if one can, because the objecte precisely slips from the image. The drives slip from the image. And that's the type of real that as psychoanalysts we are interested in. So we live, in a time of images, and the problem there is that this objet risks being lost. This dialogue we're having today, or for now a lecture, eventually a dialogue, would probably be different if we were all in the same room. Then, in this, my silly attempts at jokes, maybe a few people laugh, but I never hear them because it's all muted. One never really knows how one is really received. It's just this utter silence. I mean, at least one has the image, but that's the whole problem, is the image, something of life, which is the objet, gets negativized, as Lacan says. Yoga, meditation, the Western appropriation of Eastern spirituality all aim for a kind of a good form of the body. And those are all great practices. These are all these physical therapies are what, Colette Soler, a very important contemporary Lacanian, calls techniques of the master signifier. They try to put the body to make it fit into an order. They involve the extraction of jouissance. They claim to make the body whole and united. This is the promise of yoga, in a sense. Perhaps there is a more topological yoga, a yoga of the Moebius strip that needs to be invented. So this is the idea of the Kantian transcendental aesthetic, the mirror stage, narcissism, all these different ways in which we might experience narcissism in our contemporary situation. Narcissism as defined as the denial of jouissance, the obsession with the sanitized and sublimated body, the body being denied in its most essential aspect, which is drives and jouissance. in a sense, this is how I'm, for the purposes of today's talk, defining narcissism. It's the body without jouissance, which is as boring as decaffeinated coffee, as Zizek says, or anything rid of its toxic, but in a sense, pleasant element. So as I said, with Lacan's teaching, the emphasis starts to go more and more towards drives, jouissance, what the image hides. And we see that in Seminar 11, the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. There, and earlier as well, but there Lacan is very preoccupied with talking about orifices, the holes in the body, the erogenous zones that are libidinally invested. The psychoanalytic conception of the body includes the object A of the drive. It includes lack. So this is the important point. He's starting to develop a notion of the body that is more than the body image. How do the erogenous zones and the partial drives come about? Is when the excess jouissance of the body is somewhat removed, some of it stays. The process of removing the extra jouissance, we call it in psychoanalysis castration. It's an experience that some children, hopefully, are lucky enough to experience because it rids the body somewhat of that excess. Then jouissance is then distributed in certain parts of the body, the parts we call the erogenous zones. So now what we're starting to see, to speak topologically, to start speaking topologically, is that the new conception of the body, the conception beyond the mirror image, is a conception that includes the torsion, the kink, the curve, the twist in the Moebius strip. The erogenous zones are the torsion on the Moebius strip. We move away from the Kantian transcendental aesthetic towards a no space. It is a conception of spatiality that includes the drives. This is what Lacan calls the new space that he would like to replace the old Kantian space of the transcendental aesthetic. He calls it the no space. It is a conception of spatiality that has jouissance, that has the objet A. And the objet A, remember, is a kind of a lost object and excess object. And what is very important here, and this is completely aligned with what we said earlier, that topology is not a metaphor, is that not all representation is topology. In a sense, topology is not so much about representation. Representations existed always in psychoanalysis. Freud has plenty. The interpretation of dreams, the ego and the id, there's always representations. So Freud really liked his sort of graphs. That's not yet topology. It's a kind of optic or a kind of topic, but it's not quite topology. And the same with Lacan. He had the L schema, the graph of desire. He had the mirror model. These are not quite yet topology. Mai Wegener talks about this. Freud's spatialization of the mental apparatus, not yet quite topology. True topology is not just an imaginary illustration. There's maybe some topological tendency, but we are truly in topology the moment at which the so-called good form, that nice, symmetrical, wholesome form of the mirror image is contested, where the transcendental aesthetic is contested, where narcissism is contested. Topology has to involve the objet A, the jouissance drives, etc. Those things that curve the surface, that give it a torsion, create an unease, a symptom on the surface. So in a sense, these topological objects are objects that go against narcissism, hence against self-love. The object A disrupts the image. It breaks narcissism. It's, in a sense, one can say, a wound. It stands for the fact that humans are constitutively and universally wounded. Lacan's topological objects, insofar as they incarnate the object A, bring about a destitution of self-love. These are paradoxical objects. They frustrate our self-love. They are not objects worthy of love, in a sense. The sphere is worthy of love. It's nice, regular. The Freudian program from the beginning was about depriving thinking of its center. It was against narcissism. This was the topological center of Freud's thought. Now, love, to some measure, the feeling of love is rooted in narcissism. Love begins, and Lacan explains this. Love, when we fall in love, our relation to our own image is a relation of love. That's why we need that relation of love with our image in order to take care of ourselves, to be hygienic, etc. So when we fall in love, what is often the case, and this narcissistic root of love was already known by Freud in his famous paper on narcissism, what happens when we fall in love is that we somehow see our own specular image out there. And this is the narcissistic root of love. But the point is, not all love has to be so deeply rooted in narcissism. It would be a bit sad if love was reducible just to narcissism, so that really, ultimately, when you claim to love someone, you are really just loving yourself. That type of love exists. A young person falls in love with the professor because they would like to be like that person. Or someone falls in love with someone younger because it reminds them of how they were, and so on and so forth. It would be a sad case of love failing reaching the other's being. And well, not all love needs to be like that. There can be a love, hopefully, that takes account this paradoxical object A that disrupts the image. I like to call that topological love. There's a sort of a joke. Part of it I've sort of heard somewhere. I have no idea. I could never find the reference to this. And part of it I added something to it, trying to make it a little funnier, but we'll see how it goes. But it's an interesting little anecdote I heard. And as I said, I have no idea if it's true or not, but it is said anyway, that a married couple once confronted Socrates and asked them whether their son should marry a particular woman he recently met. He's fallen in love and they don't know if he should get married. Now Socrates, so they ask him, what do you're the wisest man of Athens, what do you think? And Socrates immediately said, oh, he should marry at once. The parents were a bit puzzled. They're like, wait a minute, you're supposedly the wisest man of Athens. Why are you being so rash? Don't you want to ask a few questions and sort of, give us an idea of how you came to this? And then Socrates was like, look, don't complicate matters. There are only two possibilities. Either she will be right for him or she won't. If she is, then there's nothing else to be said. Perfect. And if she's not right for him, then you also don't need to worry. In that case, he'll become a philosopher. Now, I have no idea if this is a true story or not. I've looked around. I don't even remember where I heard it, but there is something interesting captured by this. So now to this anecdote, I added a little sequel to make this point about topological love. So I add that the parents, upon hearing this, say, oh, yes, we know this. And our son entirely understands as well. The only problem is our son's great ambition in life is to become a great philosopher. So he's really worried that this woman will be right for him and that will ruin his ambition to become a philosopher. So what I'm trying to say with this anecdote and its sort of added sequel is that in love, we need to look for, in a way, we shouldn't look for someone who is, quote, right for us. The anecdote, what Socrates says, is very interesting. Someone who is right for you will deprive you of your philosophical ability. Why? Because it will lock you in the narcissism of love. When someone is no longer right for you, that means they make visible for you the torsion on the surface of love. Love shouldn't become a flat surface without a twist. That becomes a love that has no thought. It becomes a narcissistic love. So when looking for someone to love, perhaps it's wise to look for someone that isn't necessarily right for us. And that might enable that philosophical vocation of staying loyal to the kink on the surface, the torsion on the surface, that element of the real without which thought is not possible. So by breaking narcissism, this is the point of psychoanalytic topology and modern science, the imaginary is ruptured. So what are some various elements of the imaginary that psychoanalytic topology tries to overcome? One is the idea of linear time. Linear time is an imaginary time. It's not the way time is really experienced by humans. We live in a time of retroactivity, après coup, as Lacan calls it, or Nachträglichkeit, as Freud calls it. Thankfully, we live in such a time, because that's what makes psychoanalytic work possibly effective. An interpretation today might change your past, hopefully for the better. So our conception of time changes. Our conception of the subject changes. We have a decentered subject rather than a fully cognizing, conscious subject. And the empirical object changes. We have now the object A. So psychoanalysis and its object fall out of this Kantian frame. As Samo Tomšič puts it really well, he has written a very important article on Lacan's relation to the Kantian transcendental. And what he says there is that the psychoanalytic clinic testifies to experiences of what he calls, I quote, the maladies of the transcendental aesthetics, those sicknesses that disturb the Kantian transcendental order. Psychoanalysis is interested in sickness, not in health. Hegel also sees in sickness an opportunity. I quote Hegel. The sickness of the animal is the birth of spirit. Spirit is a break from the transcendental aesthetic. It is a break from narcissism and the imaginary. So what Hegel says sometimes spirit, in a way we could say symptom, sickness. He says it clearly himself, the sickness of the animal is the birth of spirit. Without that sickness, we'd be a boring entity. Sickness forces the human being to reassess his or her narcissism. Psychoanalysis likes, in a sense, sickness. The symptom is what is the most you. It's what's in you that is more than you. And without that thing in you that is more than you, you'll never be you. Nietzsche's famous idea, how one becomes what one is. So how does one become what one is? Well, by becoming sick. And Nietzsche was very, very, very aware that his genius and his sickness belonged together. He never fooled himself. He was, of course, the prophet of the gay, happy, joyful science. But he understood full well that he could prophetize that only because he represented the epitome of that sickness, of that symptomatic sickness that, was the source of his, in his case, of his genius, something he says very explicitly in Ecce Homo. So topology, Lacan sets his topology against Kant, as we said, but also against Aristotle. Aristotle, Samo Tomšič explains, believes in sound reason. Sound reason for Aristotle is the application of the universal to the particular. This is exactly the opposite of topology. We don't apply a universal to the particular. We extract the topology from the clinical experience. Aristotelian reason is based on syllogism and the principle of non-contradiction, which of course, psychoanalysis and Hegelian speculative philosophy embrace a certain principle of contradiction. So topology, the Lacanian topology, the structural topology of Lacan, goes against Aristotelian totality. It goes against the topology of the sphere. It goes against Aristotelian narcissism. This I quote Lacan. He says, the psychoanalyzed syllogizes occasionally, which means that he Aristotelizes. In this way, Aristotle perpetuates his mastery. In every psychoanalyzed, there is a pupil of Aristotle. So what does that mean? When the patient comes, the analysand comes, they talk. What do they present to you? What do they want to present to you? They want to present the good form. Look at me. They're giving you their ego under the auspices of the Kantian transcendental aesthetic, the mirror stage. Look how much my mommy loves me, my daddy loves me. Look at my narrative. Isn't it lovely? But then they make a slip of the tongue. They make an error. They have a dream that completely contradicts all of that. And thankfully, otherwise the analytic work would be reducible to self-marketing. But this is the conscious ego's attempt to depict itself as this spherical good form. Samo Tomšič explains quite interestingly the way Lacan situates psychoanalysis closer to Descartes than to Kant. For Kant, the I think is very pure. There is no drama of doubt or deception. There's a subject that is conscious. It's a subject devoid of qualities, desubstantialized a bit like the psychoanalytic subject, but it's a conscious subject, more robust than the psychoanalytic one. But with Descartes, things are different. Descartes goes through a whole dramatic procedure before he ends up with a cogito. First, he has doubt, and then slowly a cogito, and I think is created. There's this internal drama. There isn't this stasis. So psychoanalysis, according to Samo Tomšič, and according to Lacan, of course, is a radicalized Cartesianism. One could say Descartes was not a narcissist. He questioned all. He found that torsion at the basis of the world and of identity. It's very interesting, a bit like the mirror stage. He created an identity and then slowly rebuilt the world, but after going through this drama of doubt. And this placing of doubt and this breaking of the whole edifice upon which he stood shows the way in which he didn't just take the I for granted. So something like the object A was already there. There was already well before Kant, a kind of resistance to that Kantian transcendental or that Aristotelian good form. So the transcendental aesthetic, its main difference from psychoanalysis is that it's a philosophy of consciousness. Psychoanalysis is first and foremost about the unconscious. It's about how language exists before we do, and language creates us, not we create language. Language creates us. It intervenes. The signifier intervenes and constitutes the subject. Language produces, this is an interesting point that Tomsic made, that language is a means of production. It creates the subject and the object. Now, what's interesting is language, in a sense, doesn't really exist. But despite not existing, it has effects. And this is, I think, a very, very important category for psychoanalysis. Things that don't really exist, but they also don't not exist. You can't say language absolutely doesn't exist. It exists, but it's not a thing either. It's really just sounds, Sometimes when one listens a foreign language, one thinks, do they really understand each other? Could it be that all that means something, And in a sense, it's noise, but it has huge effects. And many things, history, the past, does your past exist? Who knows? There was that famous idea Bertrand Russell put forward, is that the whole world, including all your memories, the whole world, everything could have been created 30 seconds ago, including all your memory and all the science and every idea 30 seconds ago. So that 5 minutes ago, maybe it was all this big void. And there's now no way we could contest this idea, I guess. So the history, past, all of these things, they, in a sense, don't exist, but they have huge effects. This is something very, very important for psychoanalysis, these entities. Psychoanalysis is not interested in things that just simply don't exist, like unicorns. It's not of importance to psychoanalysis. It's also not interested in things that simply exist, like socks. I know I have socks, and it's not psychoanalytically interesting. Psychoanalysis is interested in dreams, things that have this very evanescent existence, the big other, history, the object A. It's interested in things that, like the torsion on the surface, does it really exist? I mean, where is the torsion on the Moebius strip? Is it here, here, here? At any point at which you look, it's not there. Any segment of the Moebius strip that you take is just a simple surface with two sides. But when you look at the whole, then all of a sudden it's twisted. And the torsion is everywhere. It's everywhere and nowhere. And this is the psychoanalysis is interested in these weird objects that neither exist, neither don't exist, and somehow are omnipresent. And I think when Hegel talks about spirit, he's talking precisely about the objects with that same strange ontological status. Hegel says of language, it's extremely prescient of him to say this well before Freud and Lacan. He says language is the most spiritual existence. This is, I think, the idea behind spirit in Hegel. All of these entities with this kind of amorphous ontology. That's what topology is interested in, the Hegelian spirit. It gives body to that which does not exist, but yet is omnipresent. I call those entities, in a recent article, I call them spectral entities. I follow Derrida's famous book on Marx, Spectres of Marx. Spectral entities. What is a very important spectral entity in psychoanalysis is the idea of the big other. Lacan says the big other doesn't exist, but then he always talks about it. There is not a single seminar where the other is not mentioned with the capital O in English, big A in French. You think if it doesn't exist, well, why are you bothering talking about it so much? It's a spectral entity. What is the big other? It's this assume, when people say, oh, they say this, or don't do that, it's considered rude. It's considered, we spend the whole time we raise children, their childhood, our own childhood, being taught about what the other considers good or bad. You will be respected if you study. Who by who? I'll be respected by who? Drug dealers? No, like a lot of people don't even know me. Who's gonna respect me? You will be loved if, and there's this they. It's considered rude. It's inappropriate to do this, etc. And we slowly create this idea that there's this they. And of course, it's not that slow. It's an immediate assumption as soon as we speak that there is this they, this entity that is the other. In Hegel's language, the big other is referred to as the spiritual world, or sometimes he calls it world spirit. It's this kind of not existing entity that nonetheless is always there, and that as humans, we just simply can't do without. The idea of fragrance captures well the fact that the other is spectral. This idea is this, fragrance, comes from a very interesting idea put forward by Hegel. A fragrance is a smell. It's something also with, scientifically we know it has a very clear ontological status, but in an everyday intuitive sense, a fragrance has very ambiguous ontological status. And Hegel likens what we now Lacanians call the big other, he likens it to a kind of fragrance. He says that even if the young have to be educated in solitude, and here he's criticizing Rousseau's ideas in Émile, he says one should still not imagine that the fragrance of the spiritual world will not ultimately permeate this solitude, or that the power of the world spirit is too feeble to gain mastery of those outlying regions. Very, very interesting. No matter where you go, how much you isolate yourself, this big other, this non-existing entity will somehow come and get you. Beautiful metaphor, this fragrance of the spiritual world. This is, of course, well before Kant, before Lacan, I meant. An entity that lacks concrete existence and which it is yet impossible to escape. A bit like the torsion on the Moebius strip. Hegel, Marx, Freud, Lacan, all deal with these type of spectral entities. Marx's preoccupation with these spectral entities was the subject of Derrida's book, Spectres of Marx. Hegel deals with spirit, the ethical order, world spirit, language as the most spiritual existence. Marx deals with the religious aura of commodities. He speaks of the metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties of commodities, unquote. Psychoanalysis deals with language, with history, the unconscious, with transference, the libidinal body, and so on. None of these things really exist. What exists under the microscope is just a biological body. At any point at which you look inside a body, as soon as you look, all you see is a biological body. But when you step back and you look at the whole thing, you see a libidinal body, a body traversed with language and trauma and things heard and things said, symptoms that are failed forms of communication, etc. But it's exactly like the Moebius strip. You look locally, all you see is just, a simple piece of paper. You look globally and you see this strange shape with a torsion inside. What I argue in this paper I've recently written is that the true meaning of materialism is not to preoccupy oneself with the simply ontologically material things. It's not materialism if you deal with tables and chairs. Materialism is to view spectral entities, to consider all those spectral entities, the other, language, miracles, ghosts, to think about those, but in a materialist way. Psychoanalysis is absolutely interested in ghosts and miracles. When somebody comes and calls a psychoanalyst, in a sense, they're saying, I'm here to purchase a miracle. Can you give me a miracle? That's what a suffering person wants. But the people who suffer want. They want miracles. They don't want something less than a miracle. They want something as grand as a miracle. And sure, maybe we can try. Let's see if we can. It's not guaranteed. Let's see if we can provide you with a miracle in a materialist idea, right? Of course, what kind of a sad treatment is it if right from the start one gives up the idea of miracle? When somebody suffering in mourning comes in and says, I just can't forget the loss of this person, they're in a way saying, can you help me exorcise this ghost? Yeah, sure, let's see what we can do. We're going to try to exorcise this ghost, but in a materialist way. We're not going to say, we don't believe in ghosts, ghosts, blah, blah, blah. No, we believe in ghosts, but we have a material understanding of ghosts. The whole theory of mourning is about providing a spectral materialist understanding or view of ghosts. That's what mourning is about. Mourning is a materialist exorcism. That's what mourning is. So we have two pitfalls to avoid. A kind of scientism that ignores the spectral altogether. Oh, ghosts, this is all nonsense, silly stuff, miracles, we don't believe in that, etc. Right? Like, there are a lot of this type of vulgar materialisms out there, lots. We want to avoid that. But we also want to avoid pre-modern superstition. We don't want to start taking like voodoo dolls, I don't know, whatever, like some kind of thing in the analytic session. No, we want to, it's a paradoxical status psychoanalysis has. We're interested in these pre-modern things, but in a materialist way. Hegel and psychoanalysis help us avoid the pitfalls of scientism and superstition or pre-modern thinking. Psychoanalysis is very interested in nonsense, sophistry. That's very close to the experience of psychoanalysis. The great works of Freud, what are they about? Dreams, jokes, errors. The realm of what, from the point of view of the scientific, let's say, or the reasonable, would seem like nonsense. From the point of view of the good form, what are you doing wasting time thinking about jokes, errors, dreams? Go do something serious. Go take a sample of their blood or do something serious. Get a microscope. Topology, though, concerns precisely those things. Topology is against narcissism, and it makes use of nonsense for that. When you listen to a slip of the tongue and you point it out, what happens? Patients get annoyed, aggravated. This silly, you and this Freudian stuff. Who anyways, has it been proven that this, why don't they like it? Because it targets their narcissism. They have a script they're writing for you. They are Aristotelizing, as Lacan put it. And this is, I think, the important thing, is that Freud took nonsense very, very seriously. The remarkable achievement of Freud is his courage. A neurologist, very prestigiously reputed in his time, lots of publications. This great neurologist on the path to greatness as a neurologist decides, I want to do dream interpretation. I want to look at errors. I want to write a book about jokes. What's next? You're gonna start doing chants, right? It's this shock, right? Freud was a man who had a lot to lose. It's not that he was like doing nothing and that, what the hell, I'll just write a book about dreams. He was a well-reputed doctor in his time. Imagine, you're not interested in psychoanalysis, you go to your family doctor thinking you're not well, and your family doctor just points out little errors you've done. Oh, why did you forget your umbrella? Or, just ignores everything else that you say. This is like and imagine, he's the first person to do this. It's extremely radical. People forget how radical it is, but it's extremely radical. To all of a sudden cast aside science, and Freud was a very, very scientific man, and to cast it aside for this purpose. But perhaps now we will take a little time for some questions. It's been an hour and 15 minutes. Is that a good idea, Arian? Would you agree? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Oh, that was amazing. I was mesmerized by the very, just fluid narratives that has been going on. We have already some questions in the chat that I would appreciate if you like, you gonna just maybe present them orally now. I guess that we have 2 questions by Hamid as well as by Adrian. So if you guys want to kind of like just pose those questions here as a panelist, and that might kind of like give us a little bit of more conversation. Yeah. Hamid or Adrian, do you like to?
Hi there.
Hello. Hi.
I'm very much so enjoying the conversation today. And I know I have a question up here about if you're familiar with Salvador Dali or Frida Kahlo's works, and how you feel about the psychoanalytical topics that you spoke about today in relation to their life, and how they perceived the people that they loved in their lives as well, and even themselves in the works.
Obviously I know a bit their work, not sadly enough to really comment in that way, but one thing that I could say is at least about Salvador Dali. I'm less familiar with Frida Kahlo, unfortunately, but Salvador Dali was a surrealist, and surrealism was extremely interesting to Lacan. Lacan, in a sense, he created a surrealism of psychoanalysis, and the word surreal precisely points to the spectral. It's the objet, it's that something that makes reality more than just reality. And it's precisely by taking surrealism more seriously than realism that psychoanalysis is a spectral field and not simply another science or some pre-modern discourse either. That surreal, the SUR, which points to an excess, is precisely what distorts the surface. And one sees that in Dali's works. It's really contorted spatiality. It's space that is, has a torsion in it. And this, I think, is extremely important. So Lacan was friends with Salvador Dali. I don't know if you're aware, but they have, you can Google their name, you see some pictures of them together. I don't know how close they were, but Dali was very interested in psychoanalysis. He actually read Lacan's PhD thesis on paranoia with a lot of attention, and kind of found himself a lot there. Salvador Dali, likely a paranoid subject. I mean, I'm not sure if that's necessarily true, but possibly a paranoid psychotic. And he was very interested in psychoanalysis in Lacan. And likewise, Lacan imported so many of the ideas of surrealism. The Lacanian real really means surreal. It doesn't mean reality at all. Reality is, is the coward's version of the real. It's the real mind. Reality is a decaffeinated coffee, really. The real is, Lacan has this great line. He says, the only reason we wake up in the morning is so that we may continue dreaming, because it's when we're asleep that the real really happens, right? That's when we enter the realm of David Lynch and Salvador Dali and Lars von Trier and Ingmar Bergman, and most of us don't have the courage for that. We just rather have our 0.05% beer.
I like how you related to decaffeinated coffee. Recently the waitress asked me if I wanted to have decaffeinated coffee. I was like, what's the purpose? Why? But you relating it today to all of this, really, thank you for all of this. And at some point, I'm just really curious about what inspired you to go in the direction of psychoanalytical theory in your own life.
The sickness of this animal. At some point, like you sort of see, there's something that, there's some caffeine in here somewhere. You have to admit, you're like, I thought I was decaf, but, then you realize, no, there's a lot of caffeine. And sometimes you need help with that. And then you, of course, and then that's what I was personally studying philosophy, and sometimes, I think psychoanalysis is injecting caffeine into philosophy, in a sense. And I think that studying philosophy, I realized you can't study philosophy without also studying psychoanalysis. And then, of course, that took the upper hand. And it's a bit like you saying, what's the point? Well, why would I have, and if you're in a philosophy class and someone says, would you also want some psychoanalysis? You're like, well, of course. I think today that's the main ingredient. Even it's corroborated, Agamben, Zizek, Badiou, Adrian Johnson. So many of I'm not saying all, I wouldn't make such a grand statement, but many of the very interesting contemporary thinkers include some of the caffeine.
We have, thanks, Adrian. And we have few hands raised, so I think that there are a lot of questions, and just to be as much as possible efficient. I guess that first, Antoine, you raise your hand, so do you like to?
Yeah, thank you. Quickly, I would love if you could tell the Hegel quote about fragrance. I found it. Where can I find this?
Oh yeah, sure. It's in the Philosophy of Right. I'll put the full quote. I didn't read the full quote. It's a bit long, but I'll put it in the chat box. Then you can.
Wonderful. Thank you. And the real question.
Right somewhere. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Okay.
And the real question would be about the bicameral theory and the objet petit within. When you talked about language, I understood that it was a representation of, if we are in the bicameral theory, of the left brain, and the unconscious the right brain. So I'm baby level in that stuff. I don't understand well, but would you go forward maybe in this kind of dualistic chit chat with the unconscious and the twisting and the relation within language in the left brain and the unconscious in the right brain?
So I'm just trying to see, your question is, so you're involving a kind of
I'll rephrase.
Anatomical, okay.
Let's say within topology, and if we go into neurology in the bicameral theory, which states that both half of the brain manage different systems.
Okay.
Would it be interesting to apply this kind of topology within structural biological system of the brain?
Okay.
And so personalize or anthropomorphize both both dualistic systems?
That's a very great question. It slips a little bit outside my knowledge, but what I would say is that there are, of course, like Adrian Johnson, who will be giving a talk June 15th here. Is that right, Sepideh? Yeah, it's June 15th. So, I would suggest you come. He's going to be talking, I think, more about Schelling rather than, but he has written a lot about neuroscience with Catherine Malabou. So have Pierre Magistretti and François Ansermet. François Ansermet is a French psychoanalyst, very interested in neurobiology, and Pierre Magistretti is a neurobiologist, very interested in psychoanalysis, and they have worked very well together over years and have published some really great work, which others have responded to a lot. And, and this is, of course, a big controversial question is, can this bridge, can we have a rapport, a bridge between neuroscience and psychoanalysis? And, Zizek makes an interesting observation, really, it's more than, but he says that right now, if you look at all the various competing theories of the mind, from the cognitive behavioral to neuroscientific psychoanalytic, there's of course a lot of things out there. There's this very interesting paradoxical kinship all of a sudden between the two polar opposites, the spiritualist side, psychoanalysis, Hegelian dialectics, etc. And then on the complete other side, you have neuroscience, and all of a sudden these are being bridged together. Like Catherine Malabou is bridging Hegel with neuroscience very much. Adrian Johnson is bridging Lacan and neuroscience, as are Pierre Magistretti and François Ansermet. Someone like Éric Laurent, who's a more traditional Lacanian psychoanalyst, who was actually invited by Magistretti and Ansermet to dialogue with them. It's a very interesting dialogue. So if you put all three of their names, you'll find it. I'm guessing you're Francophone from your name. I think I may be right about that. So I don't think you'll have a problem understanding the topic. It's a very great dialogue. It's going to touch a lot on the type of questions you have. I thought it was fascinating. Now, Éric Laurent was very skeptical. For him, he said, you can never do this mapping onto the brain, etc. They're very distinct. A bit like Aristotle. Like Aristotle said, a house can be defined two ways: as home where the heart is, or as a bunch of bricks that you pile together in a certain way. And he saw no kinship between that. If you, I forgot this person, there's a great book written long time ago, maybe 50 years ago, perhaps even further, Philip Rieff. He wrote a book, Freud, the Moralist of the Mind. And he really had this distinct, the you can't mix. But right now, neuroscience, and people like Catherine Malabou are bridging these together. She is skeptical of psychoanalysis. She's not very interested in Freud, and she's generally critical, but she's very interested in Hegel, and she's linking Hegel to developments in those fields, and Magistretti and Ansermet. So, I think it's a very open and live debate. So other than being able to give you some sources or anything, I wouldn't have an opinion on it, personally, at least not at this moment. But,
but thank you for all the names.
No problem.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. It's very interesting. And in comparison to Antoine Lorty, I had the feeling that your talk was non-dual. It was about the three registers: imaginary, symbolic, and the real. Because in a way, for me, this neuroscience is based a lot on imaginary. So you brought exactly this twist, this gap, this fracture in the imaginary, the twists, the gap, the voids, the nothingness. Thank you for that. My question would be, because I really feel the presence, absence, this paradox of being present and absent in the same time, this this play between veiling, unveiling of something that is and is not. Thank you for bringing this idea of spectrality. And my question is very weird, maybe. What about us? Are we spectral bodies, or we are embodied more than just specters? So what's the difference, the differential diagnosis between a phantom that is present in a way in my life because I'm identified with some father or mother or ancestor? Maybe I even don't know who exactly this ancestor is, but on an unconscious level, there's something that returns, something refulated that returns in my life. But I have this image of me and this feeling of me that I'm still incarnated, embodied, more than a specter. That's my question.
Yeah, the specter, thank you for your comments and questions. The specter, as I'm putting forward, is really the name of a paradoxical excess and lack that is added to what you rightly say is not just a specter. So, and I think that that's, you know, with the cross cap, which we will talk about a bit later, I think you seem to be quite familiar, I think, with the Lacanian topology. And I think the cross cap, we'll talk a little bit about it later, precisely shows what you're saying. I think if I've understood what you're saying is we are not just the spectral surplus, right? And I totally agree. There is, of course, and it's important to emphasize it very much, there is the transcendental aesthetic, the mirror stage. There is that more representational, more solid base, but that's not all there is. And I think that it's like coffee is not just caffeine. There's water, there's milk, there's all sorts of stuff. Caffeine is just one part, and Kant, let's say, the transcendental aesthetic, the mirror stage, etc., provides us with the cup, you know, the milk, all of that. But what Lacan discovered is that there is also this other thing in here, this caffeine, which does various things, gives a little anxiety, and caffeine is a good example because the objet precisely gives a touch of anxiety. Why? Because of the way it slips. I think, like, you know, the best way to think about it, maybe, I don't know if it's the best, but it's a good way to think about it, is that we have a libidinal body, but we also have a biological body. Mm-hmm. And the relation of these two bodies is, I think, what the topology incarnates. You know, if you isolate any part of the body and look at it, it's biological body. That's all it is. But as soon as you step back, and look at everything, it's a libidinal body. You know, and it reminds me a bit of quantum physics, right? In a given moment, an electron or any given subatomic particle will be in a superposition of two states. It'll have spin up and down. But when you actually make a measurement, it's going to be in one of the two. An electron that is looked at, it collapses the wave function and it becomes either up or down. But when you don't look, it reverts back to this spectral type of state where it's both. And it's the same thing, I think, with the libidinal body and the body. As soon as it's put under the microscope, if you look at my hand, it's bones, there's the structure, you know, and we're in the realm of biology. But as soon as you step back, you see that my hand starts doing these weird things. And why is it doing these weird things? Because language is traversing it, trauma, etc., and it's not reducible to the biological. And it's the way that these two are permeated, intertwined in a way that it's very hard to. So I completely agree with you. We are not just spectral, but it's this impossible task of figuring where does one begin and the other ends. And I think that's the necessity of the topology. The three-dimensional Euclidean geometry just can't account for it. We need this post-Eulerian topology of Moebius, L'Huillier, to think these relations productively.
Thank you a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I
Sorry,
guess that
Arian, can you hear me now?
yes,
Hi,
Hamid.
Hamid, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Alireza, for your great talk. It was very informative.
Your sound is great now.
I have to, thank you. I was wondering, I have two questions. The first is that, do you see any relation between the object A and the trauma? I was assuming that the object A could be the outcome of trauma. And my second question is that where does this object A stand in this topology? Can we, it reminds me of electron. When we look for it, we cannot find it, or it's not there when we look at it. It's not, we cannot capture it.
Yeah.
It's something in motion. Sorry for interrupting you. It's there, but it's moving.
Yeah, like a Heisenberg, right? I think the uncertainty principle. Yeah, so I think what I'm first, your question about trauma. I think the objet A stands for trauma, but in its constitutive universal sense. That's what psychoanalysis finds out, is that and up until Lacan, it is sort of mentioned. It's being built up. But with the category of the real, we kind of come that being human is a trauma, and the incarnation of it is the objet A. This is an idea that up until Lacan, I think, because he didn't yet have this idea of the psychoanalysis didn't quite have the idea of the real, it would get caught up in trying to reify trauma into some kind of idea of an event, or this happened, or this was heard, or, and then various psychoanalytic thinkers began to start developing, so Masood Khan put forward a very interesting idea in a sense, which pushes in that direction. He had the idea of cumulative trauma. Trauma doesn't only mean that, an earthquake killed all your family. It could mean, something that builds up, but still it's not a sufficient idea. And then with Lacan, we get this idea of, the trauma of language, the trauma of being human. And throughout his thinking, this idea, I think, becomes increasingly more spectral. At the very beginning, it's still pretty concrete. Lacan talks about the trauma of the constitutive weakness of humans. Right? This is a very important idea for Lacan, that humans are born as a very weak animal. Right? And so but then slowly these types of simplified references that make trauma a very, very specific thing gets changed. And precisely as you put it, this objet A, something very spectral. And so, now when somebody says that they're traumatized, we could say, well, you're human, and traumatized by what? And it's very hard to say sometimes. And it's part of the trauma of it, is that it's hard to say. Nietzsche has a great line in the Genealogy of Morals. He says, it's not suffering itself, but the senselessness of suffering that causes indignation in people. It's the fact that it's precisely because of this objet A. If you knew the reason you suffer is because of this, and you knew that and he even says, we invented God so that all senseless suffering would be eliminated. I mean, it's just this amazing passage, where with his sickness, he reveals this very universal fact. So yeah, I definitely agree with this linking. Whereas the objet is situated, in the Borromean knots, Lacan puts it right at the center of the three rings, where imaginary, symbolic, and real intersect. And, it gives an idea of the importance of this object for holding the consistency together. What you see in psychosis, especially when the psychosis is florid and not held together, like, with Joyce, it's so well held together that Lacan actually never uses the word psychosis to describe it. Yeah, but it's also clear he's not a neurotic. There's nothing neurotic about Joyce. But what happens in the cases of florid psychosis is that the object A, which is the effect of a cut, a trauma, let's say, is not there. And the consistency of the Borromean structure is made fragile. And your example with the Heisenberg, the uncertainty principle, is very apt, because that's essentially the status of the subject. This is very important. Subject, barred subject, and objet are correlative for Lacan. They both, the object A is the objectal form of the subject, and vice versa, but they both share this kind of ethereal existence, or ontological status, I should say. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dominicus Tini, if you'd like to pose, I hope that I pronounce your name correct. So if you'd like to, yes, please go ahead.
Tini Domingos, yes, hello.
Hi.
I have a question. I missed the point about narcissism being being based on the body deprived of jouissance. I mean, the incompatibility of narcissism and jouissance. This I didn't understand. If you could briefly.
And it's the way I'm kind of defining it for the purposes of today, but I'm defining narcissism as the will to reduce the body absolutely to its image. It is what I say it is. I am this way. And of course, the body has other things. It has anxiety, it has fear, it has erogeneity, it has, jouissance in a sense. And the way jouissance animates, but principally disturbs the body, is what the narcissistic tendency, which is a human tendency, tries to obfuscate, to give the body, to retain this illusion that it is just simply what it is. And of course, the intensification of a given suffering will make that illusion false, impossible to retain. And that's when you get a phone call as a clinician. Sometimes there's many reasons people call, it's a confrontation with certain truth or loss or whatever. One reason is when the jouissance that disrupts the image is no longer deniable. You just can't, and I heard that this is a silly thing to talk about, but it is kind of interesting. I heard that Will Smith started seeing spiritual therapies and things like that, because now he just cannot deny that the jouissance is, when in front of all these people, he did what he did. I mean, he lost. I mean, what happened? The jouissance took over, and then the image. And of course, he tried to salvage the image with this speech that was basically like a cult leader type of speech. I'm a vessel of love or whatever. But he was trying to do is just salvage the image after the jouissance had just completely damaged it, right? And of course, it's a very terrible situation. And now, what can you do? Yeah, I guess you have to admit that, it's better to see somebody. And yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think that we have a little bit more time, like maybe for taking two more questions. I think that Ankita raised her hand, as well as Babak posed a question in the chat. So Babak, I would appreciate if you can just pose the question here, if you can, and then Ankita, and then we're gonna move on to the second part. Babak, if you hear me, otherwise we move to Ankita. Please go ahead.
Okay, should I ask?
Please go ahead. Yes, yes.
Okay. You were just talking about, the psychoanalysts are more interested in ghosts, miracles, and nonsense and all. So if you could just, elaborate it a bit more about, like, with the theories, or, just a bit, if you just some connections with relating to some theories.
Okay. So, in a sense, to answer that question, I could say, I'm just sort of speaking off the cuff a little bit, but so there might be some inaccuracy. But in a way, imagine we could say there are two big things that psychoanalysis discovers. Of course, there are many, many more, but let's stick with two ideas. One is the idea that suffering hides a certain enjoyment. And hence, the psychoanalytic term for suffering is jouissance, which means a good time, fun. Okay, so that's the first idea. Suffering hides an enjoyment. Second idea, already that's a very weird idea. Very, very weird, very radical. Already there in Freud, elaborated by Lacan, but absolutely found already by Nietzsche, explicitly. Genealogy of Morals, third paper on the aesthetic ideal. He shows it. But anyway, that's the first idea. Second idea, also very weird, is the secret to what the unconscious enjoyment is. You can find it in errors and dreams, lapses, things like that, coming from the patient, the subject. That somehow the secret to what the unconscious enjoyment is will be betrayed in a linguistic act. I mean, linguistic in the large sense, a dream being a form of language, rebus, as Freud says, etc. These are the two ideas. And these two ideas, of course, there's many more, but these two ideas are very, very important for a clinician to keep in mind. You hear a complaint that there's a suffering. So the question is in your mind, is there an enjoyment, right? And how will I know what it is? And how will I make that known to that person? Some form of linguistic formation. It could be very, very subtle. Very, very subtle. It could be like two words that standing beside each other kind of become create a homophony with something else, and so on. But the good news is you don't have to be that perceptive, because there's a third point, is there'll be a repetitive way in which this gets disclosed. So if you miss the train the first time, the 10th time, there'll be more opportunity to hear it. And that's the a very, very important psychoanalytic point. And we had, I think, one other question.
Yeah, I think that Arij raised the hand, and maybe Arij would appreciate to pose the question, or either you want to pose, or like the question that Babak put it on the chat, but unfortunately he can't really.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure it got asked because it's such a good question. So I'm happy to read it out loud.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if psychoanalysis is interested in disconnecting the subject from any complete image it has of itself, its interest in the nonsense, and moving it towards the nonsensical, the spectral, etc., is it finally possible to do away with the notion of the subject? Or is the subject what we inevitably have to return to all the time? Is there an alternative to the subject in psychoanalysis?
That is indeed a very good question. So subjective destitution, Lacan calls it, depressive position, Melanie Klein calls it, common unhappiness. There's some sort of breaking down that does happen in the psychoanalytic process. Some narcissism is broken down. Now, this is, I think, a very important point. So what's left? You know, and Babak's sort of saying, well, if nothing is left, then what is left? And is the subject still left? Now, this is, I think, a very important point that I think constitutes a very important aspect, let's say, of Zizek's work. But, you know, so if we look at Lacan, as he was teaching, you know, he was basing his thinking on ego, on his clinical work, but his main sort of quote unquote theoretical enemy was ego psychology. That's who he was sort of battling. Now, funny enough, his own analyst, Lewinstein, was an ego psychologist. So maybe we owe all of the great insights of Lacan's work to a negative transference to Lewinstein. But that's what he was sort of pinning himself against. When Zizek goes back to Lacan, who is he? He's using Lacan's theoretical corpus, to which he adds and makes transformations, etc. But he has a different enemy. Zizek isn't that interested in ego psychology. It's kind of not, you know, he doesn't really care about Lewinstein and Hartmann and all that. Zizek is interested in postmodernism. He's interested as in terms of using Lacan to argue against whether it's Deleuze, Guattari, Derrida, Foucault, you know, etc. Bacht, maybe. Anyway, so in what way? And it precisely touches on Babak's question. What you see with Foucault is the idea of the death of man, or with Bacht, the death of the author, or with Louis Althusser, you know, there's this idea that the subject is a purely ideological idea. This is not the psychoanalytic point, and this is why, though there is this deconstructing of identity and this shaving off of our identifications, etc., this reducing of the narcissism to eliminate it in the psychoanalytic process, what we're left with at the end is not nothing, or it is nothing, but nothing as something. And so this is, you know, it sounds like a nuance, but it's a nuance with huge repercussions. What these postmodern philosophies and psychoanalysis share is the rejection of a substantialist notion of the subject. They all reject this idea that the subject is this conscious, substantial thing. They will both reject that. But psychoanalysis will say that that empty thing that it remains is something, even though it's empty. So the failure to be a substantial thing is itself a thing. And this is extremely important. And this is why psychoanalysis retains a certain dichotomy between an ego, which is a kind of idea of a substantial self, which is fictitious, and the subject, which is not any counterpart to the ego, another substance. No. Subject is only the extent to which the ego fails, inevitably always fails at defining itself in a given specific way. Every time the ego tries to create a narrative of who it is, a sort of spherical good form of what it is, it will at some point fail to achieve that. And that failure to achieve that will be the subject every time. That specific failure is the subject. And in that sense, and hopefully I managed to answer somewhat your question, something remains, but that something is an emptiness, but it's still an emptiness as something, and nothing that is a something. That psychoanalysis does not get rid of. And that's why it denotes the subject with the barred S. A barred S is more than no S at all, but it's less than a substantial S. And that is very, very important to distinguish the psychoanalytic conception of the subject and, let's say in the most extreme case, Althusser, for whom the subject is the effect of an ideological interpolation. Simple as that. Psychoanalysis, the ego is the effect of an ideological interpolation. However, the ideological interpolation of the ego will inevitably fail. Power is never that powerful in that it can absolutely determine who you are. It will fail, and that failure of ideology's attempt to create this ego, that failure is the subject. And the subject is nothing more than that failure, but it's also nothing less than that failure.
Okay, that's a very interesting question and indeed answer. So I guess that with this we can hopefully gonna go with another, maybe if you like, half an hour or so of another form of lecture, and then we're gonna open up to another few questions at the end if we would have time.
Sure.
We are trying not to pass like 2 hours and 45 minutes, maximum 3 hours, but it's a very interesting topic. So I guess that everyone is interested into staying. So maybe another half an hour of lecture, I guess that is going to pose more
I'll
questions.
talk till just a little bit before 3:30. Is that right, Arian?
That would be the idea if you can.
Okay.
Please, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
I can do that, and then we can have at least 15 minutes to half an hour for questions. So I'll skip a little bit of some of the things that you know, and try to stay with the more important ideas. So again, you know, this is the important point, is that structure for Lacan has no relation to sort of good form. I quote him: a Moebius strip, i.e. the validation of the a-sphere of non-all. He calls it the a-sphere, the opposite of the sphere, non-sphere of non-all. Structure has no relation to good form. So structure is a kind of real or surreal, as we were speaking about earlier, that you know, that finds the flaws in the good form, denounces them. Lacan wants to be rid of the sphere as good form. And he says, I quote him, "The sphere is a fiction of surface in which structure is attired." It's dressed up, attired with this fiction of the good form. That's what psychoanalysis is trying to eliminate. So in a sense, you know, to go back to Babak's question, which I find is a great question, psychoanalysis is saying that there is no subject in the sense of a sphere, you know, a full constituted sphere, but there is a subject in the sense of the torsion on the Moebius strip. There is that. Subject is this way in which space is contorted. And subject is nothing other than that. So you can't put your finger on the subject, but you can't also say it's not there. Perhaps spectral might be a word, right? So against the circle, Lacan puts forward the idea of the ellipse. Circle, in this, there's always this kind of tension between the good form and then the topological. And the topological is, for Lacan, structure. The good form is a fiction, an attire cast upon structure. Topology is not closer to structure or a good representation of structure. It is structure. And good form is this attire, this dress that is put upon it. So we have the ellipse as structure on the one side and the circle, good form, on the other. Now, for Lacan, Kepler, the person who discovered that the motion of the planets follows an ellipse, was the true revolutionary rather than Copernicus, who simply switched the place of the sun and the earth, but kept the idea of circular motion. The radical change that comes with the ellipse is that the ellipse has two centers, corresponding psychoanalytically to the subject and the other. And also with this, and Dominique Hons talks about this, we get the idea of the double inscription of trauma. Trauma is doubly inscribed. This is seen by anybody. You know, when a child is abused, let's say in the case of very explicit trauma, it's not the next day that that child is going to exhibit symptoms, not necessarily. You know, sometimes it's 10 years later. And this is a very, very important fact. You know, sometimes, you know, in these legal cases, when somebody's been abused, they say, oh, why did he or she wait 20 years to say it or something? Well, it's because trauma sometimes has this lapse of time. It doesn't, you know, something traumatic happens or an abusive thing, you're the victim of some abusing, you're not going to necessarily be symptomatic right away. It could happen much later when a certain later event re-evokes that. And so there's this two times of trauma, this Nachträglichkeit, this après coup or logical time that happens. So Lacan prefers Kepler over Copernicus. For him, it's not about heliocentrism or geocentrism, but it's really about a bifocal ellipse rather than a single-centered circle. Another opposition we have is the torus, again, on the side of structure, and the sphere on the side of good form. The torus is basically the mathematical name for what we colloquially simply call a donut. The donut is an object, the center of gravity of which is outside of itself. By virtue of that, it complicates the inside-outside distinction. And by complicating that, right, it leads Lacan to the notion of extimacy. This is one of Lacan's great concepts, extimacy, combination of external and intimate. Very important idea that problematizes, as does the topology, the inside-outside distinction. This is, of course, extremely important for psychoanalysis. I quote Lacan, "It is certain that it is only these considerations of topology, topological configurations, that can provide us with the appropriate image when it is a question of something inside that is also outside. This is why such considerations are particularly necessary when it is a question of the unconscious, which I represent to you as that which is inside the subject, but which can be realized only outside, that is to say, in the locus of the other." Psychoanalysis rejects the sphere because it is the other that determines the unconscious and the subject's desire from a point external to the subject. So that's why the torus is preferred, if you will, over the sphere for Lacan. In a sense, even in the mirror stage, when Lacan talks about the mirror stage, the image, in a sense, is found in the field of the other, in the mirror, with the help of a voice that tells the child, oh, this is you. So already in the mirror stage, which is the closest Lacan is to the transcendental aesthetic, let's say, already there's all of these ways in which a certain reference to the outside is kept, and in a way in which the narcissism is questioned. Narcissism meaning the idea that it's a circle with one center. Already in the mirror stage, very clearly, there is this other center. We're dealing with an ellipse. So if we go back to, you know, the question that was asked, is everything just spectral, or is there something? Well, it was a very great question, because there is something that isn't. There is the coffee, and then there's the caffeine. And this is what the topology is trying to really show, that there is a part that belongs or is reducible to the transcendental aesthetic, reducible to the image, reducible to the narcissism, if you will. But there is a part that isn't. And that part that isn't is not a solid counterpart to the other. They don't stand in a symmetrical relation. They stand in a relation of, let's say, spectrality that I'm trying to put forward here, is that the object A is not, oh, yes, something else. The object A, in a way, you could say, is nothing other than the fact that the image is never equal to itself. One can put it like that, you know. The image is never really what it is, and that fact that the image is never really what it is, the object A is nothing more than just that. But it's also nothing less than that. It is that, precisely. And this is what this double fact, you know, as was put forward in the question earlier, is very, very important, because we have the Kantian transcendental aesthetic, and we have that which disrupts it. So I quote Lacan, you know, and Rona Cohen writes about this very interestingly. So Lacan, the cutting of the cross cap produces two different pieces, one which can have a specular image, meaning reducible to the transcendental aesthetic, and the other one which quite literally doesn't have one. So what you get is the body and something in excess of the body. And they stand in this very strange and difficult relationship with each other. You don't have, oh, here's the body. You know, I can never divide myself. Oh, this is my body and this is my libidinal body. If you're feeling emotional, please talk to my libidinal body. Like, and if you're feeling scientific, I cannot go to the doctor and only take my biological body. If I could, psychoanalysis would never be born. So the Freud's first hysteric patients in the studies on hysteria with Breuer basically were people bringing in their spectral bodies along with their biological bodies. So there's something in excess of the body, and I quote Lacan, that is the object A. I quote, its status escapes the status of the object derived from the specular image. That is the laws of transcendental aesthetics. So what we get with the cross cap is Kant's transcendental aesthetics and the subversion of it. So in a sense, we get Kant and Hegel. Because according to my reading of Hegel, Hegel is already, well before Lacan, subverting the transcendental aesthetics. Lacanian topology is the contemporary heir to the Hegelian speculative philosophy, whose task was to subvert the transcendental aesthetic. Hegel's speculative philosophy is based on the idea of the unity of opposites. In the same way, Lacan's topological objects all embody paradoxes. The Moebius strip, a surface with only one side, the torus, the center of gravity is outside of itself. So it's only this type of paradoxical topology that can grasp an object in its inherent contradictions. This is a brilliant idea that Hegel had. I quote him, he says, space and time are the primal forms of ideology. For Hegel, space and time are already ideologies, insofar as their form, I quote, permits us to see difference in the place of contradiction. This is extremely important to understand Hegel. It's a brilliant idea. What ultimately he's saying is that the human understanding, incapable of grasping contradiction in itself, separates an entity into two parts, and the two contradictory aspects are seen as two different times. For instance, let's take a clinical entity, manic depression. So there's a time where the subject is manic and the time where they're depressed. That depiction is completely ideological, it's false. When a subject is manic, they're very depressed at that same time. Mania is extremely depressing. No, it's not a nice state to be in. And when a subject is depressed, they're also very manic. Just ask them a question and you'll see how manically they can talk about their depression. It is the consequence of the ideological effect of the fact that the human understanding thinks temporally that makes us say manic depressive psychosis with these alternating things. But ultimately, there's this inner contradiction to the entity, in this case, which was just an example, but there's the inner contradiction is separated into times. So there's time A and time B, and they are different. But in fact, the real structural fact is that they coexist in a contradictory way. So time and space are ideological categories insofar as they deny the paradoxical unity of an entity by falsely dividing it into disparate, different moments. This is how difference takes the place of contradiction. Lacan's topology corrects the shortcomings of this type of representational thinking based on temporality or ordinary spatiality. So, and this is why Lacan very famously sets his topological project as a way of overcoming the transcendental aesthetics. I quote him, "I maintain that transcendental aesthetics has to be recast in our time. Is topology not this no space into which mathematical discourse leads us and which necessitates a revision of Kant's transcendental aesthetics?" So he sets himself up in opposition to Kant, and this is exactly what Hegel set himself up as well. So here we see that unbeknownst to Lacan, or he doesn't mention it really in this respect, Lacan's topology as a resistance to the Kantian transcendental aesthetic, or as an attempt to undo and redo the Kantian transcendental aesthetic, finds a predecessor in Hegel. Now, what is promoting Lacan in this direction to undo, to revolutionize the Kantian transcendental aesthetic, let's say that, is the confrontation with modern science. For Lacan, psychoanalysis requires the birth of modern science. You cannot have psychoanalysis in the pre-modern world before the epistemological break constituted by science. The establishment of scientific discourse is a condition of psychoanalysis. And this is why it's important to kind of look at, a little bit at least, Lacan's relationship to scientific discourse, mathematics, and linguistics. And this is kind of the part 2 of the talk, which is much shorter, and I'll try to go through it as quickly as I can. So mathematics provides us with an access to the real. Mathematical formalization is an access to the real. And Lacan's structural topology is rooted in the same idea, in this idea proposed by the mathematization of the real. For instance, in Seminar 20, Lacan proposes formulae of sexuation as a way of accessing a certain real of sexual difference. Now, for Poiret, who is very influential here for Lacan, scientific discourse is inaugurated by the symbolic representation of reality. What does that mean? The symbolic representation means the mathematization of reality. Milner speaks of a major cut and historical break. The field of knowledge prior to the birth of science was very different. There is, a big gap. Lacan, I quote, "But what needs to be seen is to what extent this is a step, a truly subversive step from the standpoint of what we call knowledge." It's not there's no continuity. Zizek reiterates this, that Lacan parts with the cultural studies historicism. Modern science touches the real in a way that the pre-modern discourses don't. But it's important to remember that this rupture is more logical than chronological. There's these two distinct realms, the pre-modern knowledge that doesn't touch the real, where the imaginary plays a big role. And then, of course, there's the modern scientific revolution of the mathematical sciences. Now, generally, one can sort of see this as a historical break, but it's not like that. Like Archimedes, for instance, Poiret argues that Archimedes provides an example of science within the historical time of the Greek episteme. And conversely, we have plenty of instances of pre-modern thought in the modern world, plenty. To quip Bruno Latour, although what I mean by it is something totally different than what he means, but we are not modern. We have not yet become modern. We have the rise of New Age spirituality, the proliferation of new religiosities. We have the obscurantism of modern American psychiatry. We have a mystical faith in the so-called invisible hand of the market. These are all pre-modern elements that remain in our modernity. So what does modern science really bring? And how is it different from the Greek episteme? The Greek episteme was a great form of knowledge, but a very, very contrasting in its philosophical root from modern science. The Greek episteme highlighted necessity over contingency. The episteme was interested in what is necessary and eternal. Mathematics for the Greeks was a means to the eternal forms, the Platonic forms, was a means to God. Number for them was really number with a big capital N. The mathematizable was the perfect object. Concomitantly, the possibility of science in mankind, in humankind, was thought to be born out of that which in the human being likens him or her the most to what is necessary and eternal. And that was understood to be the soul. So the body was ignored to a large extent. And this is kind of one of the aspects of Western philosophy. Western philosophy never generally really included the body in its thinking. Some of the Eastern thinkings is sort of the body is more incorporated perhaps, but for the Greeks, the episteme, the body was part of contingency. What was necessary was the soul, and this necessary substantial entity, the soul, very, very different, diametrically opposed to the psychoanalytic idea of the barred subject. This soul was the subjective correlate of the number, the form, the eternal and the necessary. Modern science, by contrast, is interested in the contingent and the transitory. Mathematics is not a means to God or the forms. Mathematics is simply a means of measurement. It does not favor, mathematics doesn't favor certain objects. It's not looking for the perfect forms and things like that. It decodes the empirical as such. It is interested in the transitory, the not perfect, the opaque. To be mathematizable doesn't mean to be opaque. There's no preoccupation with golden means and perfect forms and things like that. It's a very, very different philosophical space inhabited by modern science and the Greek episteme. And this is all very, very, very important to understand what Lacan is trying to achieve with his topology. Modern mathematization leads to a desubstantialization of the world. The object is reduced. You know, back in Plato's time, if something was hot, it's because it had hotness in it. If it was cold, it had coldness in it. If you were tall, it's because you had tallness in you, etc. Now, of course, we know all of these things are just ridiculous reifications. There's no such thing as hotness, coldness. There's just a certain number of degree and a certain number of meters or centimeters. So mathematics, the modern scientific mathematics, is a disenchantment of the world. It just desubstantializes all these things. And it, at the level of the subject, it's the same. Jean-Claude Milner, in his masterpiece, in a sense, on Lacan, L'œuvre claire, says that the barred subject is the subjective correlate. But today, even, we have these pre-modern conceptions of the subject, these substantialist conceptions that still linger. The Jungian archetypes, the Myers-Briggs, INTP and INTJ, the empath, and these are taken very seriously by many people, but they are very pre-modern substantialist conceptions of subjectivity. Modern science requires of us as a desubstantialization. So the object and the subject are rid of their qualities in modern science. They are also sometimes rid of their qualities in the Greek episteme, but only so that they finally get to the hupakaimenon, the substance at the bottom, you know, that enduring eternal soul or whatever it is that's there. This is very, very different from the reduction that we see in modern science, that rids its objects of its qualities in order to rid it of that alleged substance. So psychoanalysis requires this move of modern science, but it must go beyond it, or it must retain a certain difference. This is very important for Lacan. For Lacan, science forecloses the subject, but psychoanalysis retains the notion of the subject. And this goes back again to Babak's question. It's a subject that psychoanalysis retains, but it's no longer the soul or the conscious subject, etc. It's a barred subject. An empty subject is still not the same as no subject at all. The analytic, I quote Lacan, the analytical trick will not be mathematical. That is precisely why the psychoanalytical discourse differs. The psychoanalytical discourse differs from the scientific discourse. This is a quote from Encore, I believe. Yeah, it's from Encore. So it's very, very important. Psychoanalysis requires the epistemological break of science, but it's not a discourse that is like the scientific discourse. Comes from science, but it needs to go beyond it in order to deal with the unconscious. Psychoanalysis began with a symptom addressed to a doctor. The attentive doctor realized that the symptom is actually a protest against the reifications of medicine. So Freud abandons the university discourse, the scientific discourse, and adopts an analyst discourse. He had to, in a way, change professions to meet the symptom. Lacan says linguistics belongs to the scientific discourse. Linguistics, I quote, is sustained by discourse, the scientific discourse. In L'Étourdi, he says the reference to the unconscious, I quote, escapes linguistics, since as a science, it has nothing to do with the par-lettre. The par-lettre is the new name Lacan uses to denote the human. And in another quote from Encore, he says, my saying that the unconscious is structured like a language does not belong to the linguistic field. Lacan puts forward new notions of mathematics and linguistics because of its appropriation by psychoanalysis. So he changes them. In Encore, Lacan's rupture, we see Lacan's rupture with Jacobson, Roman Jacobson, and linguistics. He says, in order to preserve Jacobson's domain, it is necessary to create a different word. I will call it linguistrix, linguisterie, he says in French. So if we try to conceptualize this relation between modern sciences and psychoanalysis, there is an intersection between them and between mathematics, linguistics, and psychoanalysis. But that intersection is external to mathematics and linguistics. It belongs to psychoanalysis, that intersection. And this is very important for Lacan. Now, just like psychoanalysis and the topology we've been talking about, modern scientific revolutions have been consistently going against narcissism. Copernicus, Darwin, human narcissism and revolutionary thought don't go together. Modern science doesn't care to love us or not love us. The Greek episteme loved us, placed us at the center, golden mean, gave us a soul that was thought to be linked to the Platonic forms. There was this kind of intimate bond, etc. Modern mathematical science doesn't love us in that way. This is a way in which Samo Tomšić puts it, which I find quite helpful. So the topological objects that we saw also Freud's thinking or Lacan's thinking and mathematical science, this is a very important point. This is according to Poiret, also goes against empiricism. For Poiret, the materiality of mathematical laws is greater than that of central objects. So true materialism in mathematics for Poiret comes from the mathematization. Modern science does not need central experience. This is, again, Poiret, who has a huge influence on Lacan. Cavaillès, as well, who also is very important and influential in this regard, says modern science does not need central experience. Mathematical experience is thought without central experience. This is thought to be sufficient for science. And very importantly, mathematics is detached from consciousness. Poiret says this: good physics is made a priori. Theory has a certain precedence over experimentation. The fundamental laws of motion, rest, the laws of physics are mathematical laws. Now, this is very important. This is not to say that all is theory. Mathematics is not simply applied to the world. And this is, again, a very Hegelian kind of idea. Topology is much more connected to the psychoanalytic practice than to the theory. It is not a formalism that is applied on the world in the way of a theory. Lacan says, my topology is not of a substance which would be placed beyond the real that motivates a practice. It is not theory. This is very, very important. The topology comes out of the clinical experience. Samo Tomšić makes a very interesting point. He says that theory comes from theos, which is the divine. Topology is the opposite of theory. You know, one could say in a playful way that topology is a kind of atheism. The theory, if it's used topologically, should transform at the moment at which it touches the real. And this is very, very crucial in Hegel's critique of Kant. Hegel says, formalism, Kantian formalism, I quote, imagines that it has comprehended and expressed the nature and life of a form when it has endowed it with some determination of the schema as a predicate. So in other words, he's criticizing Kant for applying the formalist theory on the world. Hegel, by contrast, and by contrast to, I think, the major misconceptions of Hegel, believes, he says it very clearly, that when the concept is applied to a thing, that changes not the thing, it changes the concept. The thing is, the example is the thing itself. And Hegel has a name for this applying of the theory on the thing in such a way that the theory changes or the concept changes. He calls this kenosis. And he likens it to the act of love. The lover reaching out to the beloved changes in reaching out to the beloved. And so Hegel's teaching is based on love and logic and on the unity of these two. Both are a kind of kenosis. And one could say that Lacan's topology is, insofar as it's not a theory that is applied to the world, it is a kind of an act of love in that sense, if you will. One last point before I end. Mathematics touches on the real of thinking. This is something that Samo Tomšić develops through Lacan and through going back to Frege. What we see with mathematics is science without consciousness. Mathematics doesn't, you know, for mathematics, the mathematician is just a tool by which the thinking is done by the mathematics itself. So here, in a way, mathematics is the most radical alienation. It's thinking without the subject. Now, in a sense, all thought is alienated in the sense that it comes from the automatism of language. Discourse is always the discourse of the other. But in mathematics, this alienation is very overt. And this is the, another important point that Lacan wants to draw from the encounter with modern mathematics. What does, Heidegger comments a lot on mathematics, the word mathematine, the Greek word, which mathematics comes from the Greek mathematine, which simply means to teach or to transmit knowledge. Teaching is one of the three impossible professions that Freud isolated: teaching, psychoanalysis, and leadership or governance or leading. These are all called impossible because they all involve transference. And the aim always in the psychoanalytic treatment, in leadership and in teaching, is to reduce the transference effect. That's the whole, the cure psychoanalytically, is so that the transference effect becomes reduced over time. A good teacher or a good leader doesn't rely too much on the effect of charisma. Authority functions best when one knows that the other is lacking. When children stop idealizing their parents, that doesn't mean that the parents' authority is entirely negated. In fact, their authority may function even better in a more so-called, let's say, healthy way. And it's the same with the transmission of knowledge. What the topology, what the mathematical formalizations of Lacan try to achieve is a kind of transferring of knowledge that is less tainted by this transference effect. So if thinking involves the pure, if mathematical thinking involves this pure autonomy of language, then mathematics allows us to conceive of a kind of teaching that is without transference. And, mathematics is one field where one can really teach oneself if one has that talent. You don't need opinion, you don't need, the intuition of a teacher or anything. You can just follow the language. So modern science inhabits this no space, this space that is distinct from the space of the Greek episteme. And philosophy needs to alter itself to that space. So what Samo Tomšič sort of says, and Lacan says, is that philosophy should follow psychoanalysis and follow modern science in entering this space that is beyond the Kantian transcendental or beyond the Greek episteme. And this is what he says, is topology not this no space into which mathematical discourse leads us and which necessitates a revision of Kant's transcendental aesthetics. So Lacan's inspiration for developing his topology came from the mathematical discourse, which he says should also push philosophy into a revision of Kant's transcendental aesthetics. So modern philosophy requires a revision of Kant in light of Hegel and psychoanalysis. And the idea that I've been trying to put forward is that a materialist reflection on spectral, spiritual non-entities is the direction in which we have to go. And topology, the structural topology of Lacan, is an instance of this type of thought. And we are now at 3:34, so we can take 15 minutes.
That's a great, yeah. No, yeah, I think that we all enjoy that. We have Mafka who raised her hand, but if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask a question that kind of coming, and I would like to know if you have any comments. And I guess that you made a comment about after the pandemic we all back to just this image beyond the Zoom, and we all can observe that these specific professions, including teaching and psychoanalysis, how impossible it is on these platforms. And if you have anything on that, and basically if you can make a comparison with what I believe that what we see the new form of narcissism in our culture, and that's basically a social anxiety with all of maybe the overpresence of the big other, and that the big other is always there, and the shame, and shame is kind of like so frequent, especially in the new generation. Could you just like with all of the ideas about the image and yeah, if you have anything on that?
You. No, yeah, I mean, I could elaborate on that. Very interesting question, and a very interesting link to shame that you made. In seminar 17, Lacan in a way predicted and diagnosed, if you will, the decline of shame in modernity, and he saw in that only the possibility of very dire consequences, because what we know from psychoanalysis is that shame is a barrier that protects one. It regulates our relations with others, and particularly the relations that involve sexual intimacy. And the loss of shame, and it's an interesting thing that in English it's very hard to find a word that is the equivalent of pudeur in French, which is not quite French, is the same as shame. It's more like modesty, maybe. A kind of modesty related to the body, and that's what we see is in a certain decline. And what ends up happening, and this was what Lacan was sort of conjecturing, is that this protective shield is going to be lost, and shame in a way regulates the jouissance of the body. It regulates suffering, and it's an extremely important event in the life of a child, is the moment at which they become aware of shame. You see children when they're 2 or 3 years old run around nude and they don't really care about it, but when they're 4 or 5 or 6 years old, they absolutely would not. They start saying private parts and things like that. Children for whom this transformation doesn't happen are prone to great suffering later, because the sanctity of their body is not protected. And this is essentially what Genesis is about. The story is, how does God find out that they bit the apple? Is because when he comes back, they cover their Eve covers her body and Adam covers his eyes, which are the gendered forms of the traditional idea of the man enjoys seeing and the woman enjoys being seen. And it's their awareness of nudity lets God know that, oh, they're ashamed, they bit the apple. And so the story of Genesis shows the effect of castration. It's the recognition of shame. Now, what we're seeing, and this brings up to the great points you were making, is that the modern or late modern injunction placed upon all of us, particularly maybe more the young are more vulnerable, is the injunction to enjoy, to have as much sex as you possibly can, or drink, or clubbing, or whatever. There's always the superego, as Zizek says, tells us to enjoy. And the problem with this constant pursuit of enjoyment is that the barrier of shame gets finally breaks down. And when the barrier of shame breaks down, instead of shame, one gets utter humiliation. There's this very beautiful line by Julian Green, which I can find for you very quickly. I'm just looking for it here. God, unable to make us humble, made us humiliated. When you lose your humility, you don't gain in confidence. You disparage into humiliation. And this is, I think, one of the dangers that the contemporary social bond is facing.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Mafka, I guess that you raise your hand, and sorry that I take your turn before you.
Yeah, so on the note of you speaking about like the advances of conquering narcissism of like science, I guess, and modernity. I'm wondering how you would relate your position to eliminative materialism, which sees psychology as like wholly material, sees humans as purely neurological mechanisms, and which seems to me like, yeah, like the ultimate blow to kind of human narcissism, and because it, especially because it calls for the elimination of like intentionality and other categories of folk psychology. I'm just wondering where you would place yourself in relation to that position.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting point, because I guess the idea of spectrality and the object A and all of that, as much as they are a blow to narcissism, there's still a bit of a narcissism in holding those ideas, I think is what you're saying, because the more reductive views that you mentioned, the eliminative, could you repeat the word, eliminative?
Yeah, eliminative materialism.
Right, the eliminative materialisms, they are even a bigger blow to narcissism in a sense. But I guess, this is the line, the very famous sentence by Hegel, where he says, not only as subject, but also as not only as substance, but also as subject, right? I'm trying to see if I can find the full quotation, but it's one that, let's see if I can find. Everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. So the idea there is that, and Hegel was a big critic of the type of, to speak a bit anachronistically, eliminative materialisms of his time, which were like physiognomy, and there was a tendency in the 19th century to reduce the human to the very basically biological, and perhaps there is still today. And for Hegel, Hegel contested it. The spectral is. The idea of the spectral, the objet A, the libidinal, all of these are a resistance to that type of materialism. They're also a resistance to the pre-modern substantialization of the soul or consciousness, etc. So in a sense, the Hegelian psychoanalytic outlook, topological outlook I'm putting forward is kind of walking on a tightrope with the type of philosophies you mentioned on one side and pre-modern thinking on the other side. It's this type of tightrope, like it's walking on the kink of the Moebius strip. Now, some people may disagree and say, oh, this whole kink on the Moebius strip is just nonsense or whatever. But for me, I think that this is my sort of belief, is that the materialisms that are not spectral will eventually, if you push those thinkings to their limit, they will eventually stumble on a substantialist and essentialist core somewhere. And so the idea I'm putting forward, which may be controversial or maybe wrong, even I don't know, but I obviously put it forward because I believe it, is that the only materialism that can remain a materialist always is a spectral materialism, which is an idea, that I'm developing through the reading that Derrida offered of Marx, and in so doing, he of course mentions Freud too.
Thank you. I think that Felice, you posed a question in the chat. If you'd like to pose it here, if you can hear me now, please.
Yes, hi everybody. Can you hear me
Hi.
okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, no camera today. I guess my question is just thinking about computation, because your discussion of mathematics just brings it up in my mind, and most of us are using technology actually on some level actually in this cohort, but on the sort of more general level, I guess, how do you, in your opinion, of course, how do you think accelerated computation that we have right now how does that pressure inflect the spectral of the human?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question. We'll try to answer. I hope I can give something satisfactory, because ultimately I don't know. But one thing that I would say is that the ideas have a certain kinship, because, and I think this is the crux of what Lacan is trying to say. He's trying to say that mathematics, or we could now say computation, shows us that thinking doesn't require the conscious subject. It doesn't. Mathematics, we're a tool of it. It just moves along. What mathematics shows us is thinking in its most real, in the Lacanian sense, way. It's autonomous. It's a completely autonomous language. A good mathematician is just someone who can sprint fast enough on this course, faster than the next person. Now, for Lacan, though, as important as this experience that modern mathematics brought is, for Lacan, psychoanalysis, as important as this is for it, psychoanalysis is not reducible to it. And the reason for that is psychoanalysis cannot exclude the notion of the subject. It does not deny that thought can be that radically alienated, as we see in computation or mathematics. But psychoanalysis, in a sense, and this maybe touches also on Mafka's very interesting question, nonetheless, psychoanalysis retains this idea of the spectral, and this is the way I'm putting it, which distinguishes, because of what I've been thinking about it, because this is very clear in Lacan, he resists the idea. He accepts psychoanalysis can only exist within the horizon of modern mathematical science, but then he resists absolutely that psychoanalysis can be reduced to a modern mathematical science. It has to be something else. So in thinking about this, the answer that I sort of came to is because only this way could it retain this category, which I call the spectral. So computation, mathematics, modern science absolutely needs nothing of psychoanalysis. There are sometimes some people who will make this claim that science needs psychoanalysis. Not true at all. Science is completely independent. It can do very well without psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, the logic of the signifier, Marxism, all of these things, that they have nothing to teach science. Psychoanalysis can only be born within that horizon, but it may do something, as Lacan has, with linguistics and mathematical formalization. But what it does, the mathematical formalizations of Lacan, and I don't know if I'm really answering a question, in a sense, are not mathematics. I don't know if I answer it really, but in a sense, yeah.
I think it's a great response in the sense that it kind of gets to your own thesis about alienation, actually in the kind of revision, perhaps, because you're kind of taking it and kind of saying, well, math doesn't need humans, I guess. But in a way, the question really is about how it does inflect the spectral within the human. And maybe we don't know yet, or maybe there's I'm sure there's theories, but this idea of the revision, I think, is quite interesting. Mm-hmm. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. No, it was a great question. Thank you very much.
So I guess that we are quarter to, actually 10 minutes to 4 p.m. We're almost near to the end, and then I don't see any active question or hands raised. So I believe that we can say goodbye for now, and if any final remarks by Alireza that we can have, or we can
no, I think we can wrap it up there. I think I managed to cover most of what I wanted to. Thank you all for your questions. Some excellent questions were very great. Thank you, Arian, for moderating, and that was
my pleasure. Really.
Thank you for your great question, and also Sepideh, thank you so much for making this happen, and hope everybody has a good rest of the weekend.